So statistics, I mean, this isn't a module on statistics, but we can say a few things. Um, talking about generalizations, I mean, samples must be large and they must be large enough. And they must be suitably varied. But one of the things people very often don't understand is you don't need huge samples if they're representative, right? So sometimes people say, oh, you know, a quarter of the British population believes a certain conspiracy theory. And people say, well, you know, and you look at the data and it's like 2,000 people interviewed over a weekend. You think, well, 2,000 isn't very much for a population of 60 million or whatever it is. Yeah, but if it's the right sample, and if the questions are asked the right way, so that you're able to screen out intervening factors, then that can give you a good result. And pollsters know what they're doing most of the time. But the sample must be varied and it must be representative. So if you just, you just go down the pub and ask people who are there some question about, how the world works, you'll get answers skewed towards people who happen to be down the pub, right? So if news organisations go to shopping centres in the afternoon to find out what the British population thinks, they will tend to find out what people who are hanging around in shopping centres in the afternoon tend to think. So if it's a question about the world of work, then they may not get very informative answers because everybody who knows about the world of work is at work. Okay. I want to say a word about Simpson's paradox. So Simpson's paradox is that you can't tell how good a hospital is just by looking at the death rates, right? So suppose that you need a heart operation, and there are two hospitals, and one of them has a really high death rate, and one of them hasn't lost a single patient. You might think, okay, I'll go to the one with a really low death rate because I want to survive, right? I want to survive. So I'll go to the hospital with a low death rate. But wait a minute, maybe the hospital with the high death rate is the one that's treating people for heart conditions. And maybe the one with the low death rate is treating people for some other kind of procedure altogether, some kind of relatively safe procedure, right? Actually, it may be better to go to the hospital with the high death rate if that's the hospital that treats the kind of deadly heart disease that you're suffering from. So you have to compare like with like. All right, so the next thing I want to say about numerical reasoning is that, so I'll give you Larver's law of spurious large numbers, which is this. Big numbers are meaningless on their own. In fact, numbers generally are meaningless on their own, right? A number, a statistic anyway, is meaningless unless there are other numbers to compare it with. Numbers need other numbers for context in order to be meaningful. So supposing somebody says, more than £10 billion has been earmarked for spending on health in Scotland over the next year, right? So, whoever's responsible for healthcare in Scotland is being interviewed aggressively, and they say, look, we're adding another £10 billion to Scotland's healthcare budget next year. Well, the healthcare budget for Scotland was always going to be a big number compared with, my salary and your income and any other sums of money that we might have to deal with. So the mere fact, it's always going to be a big number. Half of the required number, half of the required sum would also be a big number compared with the kind of money that we're used to dealing with. So is 10 billion enough? Is it too big? Is it too much? Is it not nearly enough? I've no idea. Unless you've got the existing budgets some sense of what the existing budget shortfall is, just saying, well, we're putting in some huge number. So politicians do this all the time, right? They'll give you a big number, and that's supposed to make you shut up and go away. It's alarming how often interviewers don't call them on this and don't ask them for the numerical context that makes that number meaningful. One of my personal favourites, this was University of Hertfordshire Advertising. 2003 sees the beginning of an exciting new stage in the life of the university as our new £105 million Hatfield de Havilland campus welcomes its first students. Okay, so £105 million is what it cost to build the de Havilland campus. And this was in all of the university's advertising at the time. This number, £105 million. Now this advertising was aimed at who? At prospective students and their parents. Now, I've no idea how much it costs to build a university campus, and I don't believe any of the prospective students did, and very few of their parents, unless their parents were in the campus building business. Is £105 million a lot? Is it too much? Was the university stiffed? Is it not enough? Were they cutting corners? I have no clue. And the marketing department, the university's marketing department, presumably didn't know either, and were relying on the fact, if they even thought about it, that nobody looking at this this advertising would have any clue whether £105 million is enough or too much or not enough. They just threw out a big number because they had a big number available. It was meaningless. Now it was harmless because I don't actually think many people made their decision about which university to go to by looking at that big number. But it does matter in collective reasoning, where we're being invited to think about rival budget proposals. Okay. The last bit of classic statistical reasoning that I want to tell you about is survivor bias. So here is a diagram indicating damage on American bombers returning from missions in the Second World War. This is the accumulated damage from many planes on many missions, represented on a single diagram, right? And the question was, where do you reinforce the plane? If planes are returning from missions with damage in these areas, and you have the possibility of adding some extra armor or some reinforcement of the frame, where do you put it? Well, the first thought that the Air Force had was to reinforce those places where planes get hit. Wrong answer. Wrong answer. Because, of course, this data is gathered from the planes that made it back. If you assume that anti-aircraft fire hits the population of bombers randomly, then what you get from this diagram is that the planes that don't make it back are the ones that get hit in the areas where they don't have any record of damage, right? And it's actually, when you think about it, it's obvious. If planes get hit in the engines or in the pilot area, that tends to be the ones where they fatal strikes where the plane doesn't return. So if you're going to reinforce anything, reinforce those areas where there are no planes returning with damage in those places, because those are the places where there are fatal strikes. There was a similar story. They introduced a new kind of infantry helmet, and they had an increase in soldiers going to field hospitals with head injuries. And at first they thought maybe the helmet is a bad design, until somebody pointed out that no, what's happening here is actually the helmet is working, because what you're getting is soldiers making it back to the hospital with shrapnel injuries that would have previously killed them with the old design of helmet. And survivor bias is rife. Survivor bias is responsible for nostalgia. Whenever anybody says, oh, they don't make tools like they used to, or they don't make furniture like they used to, pointing at some tool or some piece of furniture that's survived decades, well, yeah, of course, the pieces of furniture or the tools that are still in use now are the ones that have survived. All the rubbish stuff that people would produce at the same time has all broken. Same with, oh, music isn't as good as it used to be. You know, listen to the old songs. No, the old songs that are presented to you as evidence that music used to be better is the stuff that's survived the edit of history. You know, the great edit of history has edited out all the rubbish. If you go back and listen to the charts from the 50s, I mean, your ears will bleed with pain because most of it was rubbish. Although, you know, the music was better in the 60s because, you know, like the Who and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, yeah. Spend half an hour listening to Freddie and the Dreamers and Herman's Hermits and all the rest of them. Survivor bias, right? The Who and the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, these are the records that survived the great edit of history. Yeah, so you find survivor bias all over the place, including in anecdotes about diseases, right? People say, oh, this disease is just like the flu. I had it and, you know, and I survived. Yeah, you don't get testimonials from the, you know, you don't get anybody saying, yeah, I had it and it killed me. So the testimonial evidence will tend to favor survivors. And on that cheering note, I will end the Halloween edition of lectures on reason persuasion, and I will see you next week.